Hello learners, and welcome to the 29th lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. We have been discussing the life and work of the English and American poet T.S. Eliot. In this lecture, I will take a few minutes to wrap up that discussion by summarizing and introducing a few key ideas which will help us interpret 4 quartets and also read a little bit from the opening sections of the poem. After that, I will leave the work of T.S. Eliot and move on to the work of another very important 20th century poet, the American Robert Lowell. So, to briefly recall an idea that I had discussed in the previous lecture, the poem 4 Quartets is obsessed with the idea of time. It is obsessed with the idea of how, as time passes, things change. It is quite preoccupied, the poem and the poet, they're both quite preoccupied with the futility of human agency in the face of time. Time has such force that it seems to almost make all human effort irrelevant. The poem and the poet are trying to make sense of that, trying to find a way to value human effort and human resilience in the face of such unshakable power. In this context, it is important to remember a sentence that T.S. Eliot had written as a young poet, which is that every poem is an epitaph. The word epitaph in this sentence makes sense, and it emerges through its connection with poetry. Epitaphs are words written on tombstones, on graves of people who have died and are buried. A poem describes things that are no longer in existence. A poem in that sense is mourning for lost time. A poem in that sense is a document written as a form of expressing one's longing for something that cannot be accessed anymore. So these places, Burnt Norton, the dry salvages, East Coker, etc., these places are examples of time's passage, and the poets sense that these important places signify the occurrence of important historical events. As Eliot writes about these places, he ends up describing a spiritual autobiography of himself. This is the first thing to note while reading the poem. The second thing is that the poem stages a very complex and sophisticated intellectual debate. The key aspects of this intellectual debate are religion, logic, and how aesthetic experience can be reconciled to the spiritual experience of religion. Eliot indicates the intellectual nature of this debate in the very first words. The poem begins with an epigraph, and the epigraph is important because it gives us a clue as to how we must read and interpret the poem. Eliot indicates the religious matrix of the 4 quartets by taking his epigraphs from the Greek philosopher Heraclitus. Heraclitus was famous in the place named Ephesus in modern Turkey about 2,500 years ago. Now, the scholar Helen Gardner, who wrote the first investigative and closely read book of interpretation in response to the 4 quartets, titled The Composition of the 4 Quartets, which was published in the year 1978. In that book, Helen Gardner noted that in the Faber pamphlet, where 4 Quartets was first published as a collection, these Greek epigraphs were printed on the reverse of the table of contents, as if applying to the whole sequence. However, in the collected poems, when the 4 quartets were republished, these epigraphs were reverted to being the epigraphs to Burnt Norton alone. So there is a sense, the shifting of the epigraphs, the shifting location of the epigraph tells us that for Eliot, it was clear that these epigraphs signified the contours of an intellectual reflection. The fact that it was easy for Eliot to shift them from the beginning of the entire sequence of 4 poems to the beginning of the first poem of the same sequence of 4 poems means that the epigraph and the ideas contained in it exert an explanatory power over the poems that follow. So, what is the epigraph? In translation, the epigraph from the philosopher Heraclitus reads thus: "But while the logos is common to all, the multitude live as though each had a private understanding. Further, the way up and the way down are one and the same." So, what did Heraclitus believe, or what can we make of this? Heraclitus's beliefs, and Heraclitus is known to have made a very famous statement which has earned him a place in many stories or many summaries or children's or young adult books about the history of philosophy. And the statement goes is something to the effect of we can never step into the same river twice, or we can never put our finger into the same river twice. What does it mean? It means that as water flows, the reality of the river changes. So just as we put our finger into a flowing river, and when we take our finger out, the river has changed because water is flowing. So every instant, the world around us is changing. And this change, the way nature is always in flux, this is an essential truth about our civilization and our existence. A philosopher needs to make sense and account for this constant, endless, non-stop change in the nature of things. So this is a key idea that Heraclitus posited, that all things flow, and then opposites are related through a principle of unity expressing itself as fire. The logos that human minds can tap into is identical with this fire. By nature, things are bound to change, to be consumed by the cosmic flux, transformed elementally downward toward water and earth, or elementally upward toward air and fire. So these are the 4 key elements: water, earth, air, and fire. And all reality is a matter of things shifting from one form to another, one of these 4 forms: water, earth, air, and fire. Now, the word logos is important, and it is especially important for those trying to understand Eliot's poem. The word logos is translated into various English variants. Sometimes it is translated as word, sometimes as speech, sometimes as thought, and sometimes as reason. It appears throughout the philosophy and literature of classical Greece. It launches the Gospel of John in the Bible with the words, "In the beginning was the Word." If Western culture can be imagined as an ancient building, the Logos is its cornerstone, the foundation of science and rational theology. Its presence here suggests that Eliot intends to explore the reality that is common to all. The word logos establishes that the 4 quartets, the poems that follow, will be a reflection of a very philosophical kind on the nature of reality. So on the one hand, the first epigraph from Heraclitus suggests a denial of nominalism. Nominalism is a philosophical approach. It's a school of thought which is exemplified in the work of the philosopher William of Ockham, and which in some views was taken to an extreme by the philosopher Jacques Derrida, who holds, this philosophy holds, that there are no universal truths, only names of things or individuals. For Eliot, the act of naming is not an empty nominalism, but an opening for ghostly presences. So this is the first idea we get from Heraclitus. Things cannot just be named, or rather, simply naming things does not produce reality. We can perceive, to go back to that example of the river, we can perceive that we are stepping into the same river, but our calling it the same river does not change the reality, which is that nature has changed. As time passes, ecological processes are constantly moving, and the same river has changed. So, this is the first idea. The second idea is that, and this is in the second sentence, it suggests that there are severe limits to what reason and the senses can tell us about reality. If the way up and the way down are one and the same, then paradox trumps positivism. And this is the final idea that I will discuss before moving on, the importance of paradox. Paradoxes shape a great deal of Christian thought, from the work of St. Augustine to the 16th century Spanish mystic St. John of the Cross, and from Dr. John Donne, the Dean of St. Paul's, to G.K. Chesterton. All of these writers are part of an intellectual tradition. In this intellectual tradition, these writers explore paradoxes, and Eliot was very strongly influenced by these writers. Eliot's Christianity, and this is the final point from Four Quartets, Eliot's Christianity is generally compared to that of Michel de Montaigne, the 16th century French essayist, who charmingly mocked the pretensions of human reason. Montaigne, in his Apology for Raymond C. Bond, a work Eliot certainly knew, notes the irrational fervor for sleight of hand enchantments, communication with the spirits of the dead, prognostications, horoscopy, and the seat of Mass being located in the middle of the triangle of the hand. Now, there is a reference to this exact text in the third poem that makes up the Four Quartets. This poem, titled The Dry Salvages, has a section, the fifth section, which begins thus: to communicate with Mass, converse with the spirits, to report the behavior of the sea monster, describe the horoscope, haruspate or scry. So, this is an instance of Eliot describing himself and demonstrating several attributes of his intellectual and creative makeup. The aristocratic nature, which Montaigne also was, the conservative nature as a thinker, and finally, the idea that they were both skeptical Christian humanists. So, while we wrap up this discussion, I would like to say one more thing. This is a poem, Four Quartets, in which Eliot presents what is perhaps the most ambitious, intellectual, creative, and spiritual statement in his career as a poet. It is ambitious because here Eliot reconciles what appear to be contradictory tendencies in his creative and critical thought. The chief contradiction is between aesthetics and religion. It appears that aesthetics is a secular world of secular, immoral world governed by science and logic, whereas faith or spirituality is a moralistic world governed by abstract ideas. This is not a contradiction, however. There is no contradiction between these two things, because both give Eliot a way of unifying experience. Experience is something that Eliot was often skeptical of. How do we know that an experience that we have had is truly real? Another version or another way of asking this question is to say, how do we know that what we claim to be ours, or what we claim to be an identity, how do we go from an experience to an identity? How do we know that we are an individual self who is unified, common, and who is having these experiences? So both experience and self are very difficult to define, and yet it is extremely necessary to define these things if we are to function in this world. For Eliot, this was a very important question, one that was very difficult to answer and yet necessary to try and answer. For Eliot, the way to understand experience was through the flux of language and ideas. And this approach to understanding experience through flux of language and ideas is common to both aesthetics and religion. One final reference before leaving Eliot and moving on. Two thinkers who were very important to Eliot and whose influence can be seen, felt particularly strongly in four quartets, are Walter Pater, the 19th century aesthetic thinker, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American transcendentalist. Pater gave Eliot his ideas on aesthetics, and Emerson gave Eliot his ideas on spirituality. I invite you to read the poem, to explore its many nuances. It is a beautiful, powerful, and extremely spiritual reflection. It is an intellectual statement by a poet who, at the end of his career, had switched styles, had taken a much more personal, accessible, simpler, and late style. But the intellectual concerns are not diminished. In fact, one can say that the intellectual concerns that Eliot had as a young poet are sublimated to a higher level. There is a much more peaceful appreciation of the unsolvable and mysteries of this world. So, with this, we will wrap up our discussion of T.S. Eliot and move to another very important poet whose name is Robert Lowell. Robert Lowell was born in the year 1917 and passed away in the year 1970. Robert Lowell won the Pulitzer Prize and was an extremely well-known American poet in the second half of the 20th century. Robert Lowell grew up in Boston, Massachusetts. He studied at Harvard University and Kenyon College. He's best known for the volume Life Studies, which was published in the year 1959. But his true greatness as an American poet lies in the astonishing variety of his work. In the 1940s, he wrote intricate and tightly patterned poems that incorporated traditional meter and rhyme. When he published Life Studies, he began to write startlingly original, personal or confessional poetry in much looser forms and meters. In the 1960s, he wrote increasingly public poetry. And finally, in the 1970s, he created poems that incorporated and extended elements of all the earlier poetry. Meanwhile, he also produced a volume of translations he called Imitations and wrote or translated several plays. Lowell had a profound interest in history and politics. In his poetry, he juxtaposed self and history in ways that illuminated both. His art and life were inseparably intertwined, and he believed firmly in the identity of self and language. The importance of writing about his own life, the importance of writing about the individual named Robert Lowell, who was born in the year 1917 and passed away in the year 1977, the relationship between the real human being that he was and his poetic compositions was important to Lowell. In fact, Lowell's writing can be said to have introduced in a very powerful way the tradition that we call confessional poetry. Confessional poetry has a few poets who are commonly understood as a part of this camp. Robert Lowell is considered the first in this camp, but there are others like Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath, John Berryman, Allen Ginsberg, and several others. These poets were all inspired by Robert Lowell and followed Lowell's call for writing about personal matters. Writing about this collection, Life Studies, Robert Lowell said in an interview that his goal was to help readers appreciate and understand the real Robert Lowell. This expression, the real Robert Lowell, gave rise to the idea that this was a confessional poem, that these poems were autobiography written in verse. That is a somewhat misleading idea because even though there are strong autobiographical connections between the life that Robert Lowell lived and the things that are described in these poems, we cannot assume that the autobiographical explains everything. There is a great deal of formal complexity that the poet adds to the events that are recalled from his life. So, in this context, it's important to remember another quote, another sentence that Lowell wrote. In the year 1977, in an essay titled "After Enjoying 6 or 7 Essays on Me" in the magazine Salmagundi, Robert Lowell wrote these words. Looking over my selected poems, about 30 years of writing, my impression is that the thread that strings it together is my autobiography. His poetry, and in particular a prose sketch titled 91 Revere Street, which forms an important part of life studies, give glimpse after glimpse into the world of his childhood. What was this world like? Robert Lowell was born into a home dominated by two opposing tensions. On one side, the tension came from his ineffectual father, and on the other side, it came from his imperious mother. His father was a member of the famous Lowell family of Massachusetts, a very well-off business and financially very secure and rich line of people. And his mother's prominent family, the Winslows, dated, like the Lowells, back to the early days of New England. So both in terms of historical prestige, historical lineage, and in terms of financial well-being, Robert Lowell came from a very, very elite, very secure, very established background. Perhaps due to this, the young Robert felt very acutely the strains of his childhood, and both his immediate family and his Puritan forebears would figure largely in his poetry. In the prose section titled 91 Revere Street, Lowell described his experiences at the Brimmer Street School in Boston. He later attended preparatory school at Harvard in 1937. He had a fight with his father and left home, a rebellion that had serious consequences for his life and his poetry. Lowell went south when he left home, when he had a brief rebellion at his home. He made a southward journey, something that his contemporary, his peer, and his colleague Elizabeth Bishop would write about in her first collection, North and South. So just like a fellow New Englander, Elizabeth Bishop, Lowell made a journey from the north to the south. Lowell went south to the Tennessee home of the poet Allen Tate. Tate proved to be an important influence later on the young Robert Lowell. In 1961, Lowell gave an interview to the Paris Review magazine titled The Art of Poetry, and described a story about how he arrived at the home of the Tates. And despite there being no room in the family, because the Tates were hosting several guests, Lowell decided to pitch a tent, quite literally to live in a tent in the garden, in the lawn outside the Tate home, and live there. He began to publish consistently through the 40s and gained quite a bit of success. Lowell had become a respectable figure by the time he published. So through the 40s, Lowell achieved quite a bit of success and respect as a poet. He published 2 collections of poetry and was fairly established, fairly well known as a poet. The 50s were a very decisive decade because it was at the end of this decade, in the year 1959, that he published Life Studies. The 50s were a time when Lowell did not publish as much, having published both his first collections in the 40s. The collection that had appeared just before Life Studies was titled The Mills of the Kavanaghs, Now, between The Mills of the Kavanaghs and 1959, when he published Life Studies, Lowell taught at several universities and made a speaking tour of the West Coast, where he encountered the thematically and stylistically revolutionary poetry of Allen Ginsberg and the other beat poets. He continued the friendship he had earlier begun with the poet William Carlos Williams, who, as an innovator in language and forms, began to have an important influence on his work. Lowell and Hardwick is Elizabeth Hardwick, who was his partner and wife. Lowell and Hardwick lived primarily in Boston during this time. The poet taught for several years at Boston University, and their daughter Harriet was born in the year 1957. During this period, Lowell continued to suffer attacks of mania and depression, and for a while found it difficult to write. In the same essay from Salmagundi, from which I quoted earlier, Lowell wrote, "When I was working on life studies, I found I had no language or meter that would allow me to approximate what I saw or remembered. Yet, in prose, I had already found what I wanted, the conventional style of autobiography and reminiscence. So I wrote my autobiographical poetry in a style I thought I had discovered in the work of the French novelist Gustave Flaubert, one that used images and ironic or amusing particulars. I did all kinds of tricks with meter and the avoidance of meter. I didn't have to bang words into rhyme and count." Now, Life Studies, it's difficult to overstate the importance of this volume. In an essay appearing in Next to Last Things, New Poems and Essays, the poet and scholar Stanley Kunitz has called this volume, Life Studies, which won the 1960 National Book Award, perhaps the most influential book of modern verse since T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. There is no question but that its so-called confessional poetry was something radically new in American literature. As Marjorie Perloff declares in The Poetic Art of Robert Lowell, this poetry is informal and autobiographical. Its diction is casual and colloquial. Its sound patterns tend to be almost prosaic. As Marjorie Perloff declares in The Poetic Art of Robert Lowell, this new poetry is informal and autobiographical. Its diction is casual and colloquial. Its sound patterns tend to be almost prosaic. Now, focusing on one important poem, Skunk Hour, which we will discuss in the next lecture, Perloff, the scholar, says that the one dark night of that poem, the painful moment of terror and anxiety that leads to a renewal of self-insight and understanding, this is the central experience that Lowell's self undergoes. Some readers were troubled by the personal nature of many of the poems in this volume. Several of the works deal with Lowell's reminiscences of childhood and include often unflattering portraits of his parents and grandparents, while others deal with his marriage, his illness, and other aspects of his adult life. So, at this point, I will wrap up this lecture by reiterating some key points. First, Robert Lowell is a confessional poet. This is not to say that the poems are simply recollections or autobiographical memoirs set to poetry. But it is important to understand how poetry and the particular style in which Lowell wrote gave this particular poet a unique and the best possible medium through which he could communicate the uniqueness, the pain, the joy, and the humanity, the singularly powerful experiences that he had. And we will understand how Life Studies became such an important and iconic collection in the history of 20th century American and English poetry. We will do so by focusing on one poem, the final collection in this volume, titled Skunk Hour. We will do that in the next lecture. Thank you.